Hey, what's up everyone? In this video, we're going to build this pretty cool responsive layout, and we're going to use Tailwind CSS grid utilities to achieve that. Let's get right into it. Alright, so the other day, doing some design browsing, as I tend to do, I found this website, Linspin, which I found pretty interesting. Particularly, this section here caught my attention. So we basically have this two-column layout with a title, and then some team members, and a little bit of text here. When a bit more space is available, the layout completely restructures at this breakpoint here. And I thought, how easy would that be to build with Tailwind CSS? So the idea here is not to do a replicate of this UI at all, but rather look at how we could lay elements out in a similar way that behave the same responsively, starting with a mobile-first approach using utility classes from Tailwind. Okay, I've taken two screenshots of this page that represent the two main states of this grid. So we have here the narrow view that has two columns, and then you can see that it jumps into a 4-column wide layout. As a starting point, I have a completely empty index.html page, and we're going to write our code in here. Our CSS file is the default Tailwind 3 directives. And in our config file, you can see we have the just-in-time mode enabled, so things are nice and fast. And I've also added an extra small screen here at the 540 pixel breakpoint, just because we want to start with a completely one-column stacked layout and start with the two-column grid at this breakpoint. Looking at our two screenshots, you can see we have the same elements, but laid out in a different way. And it would be tempting to start coding by adding the title, and then the first image, and then the paragraph text. But what we're going to do is lay out the markup without worrying about the layout at all. And then we're going to use CSS grid to organize the elements on the page like we want. Let's start writing some code, and we'll start with a wrapper, which is going to be our grid container. So that grid. Having a grid allows us to have a gap property as well. So I will go with gap 4. And to make it look a little nicer and not touch the edges of the viewport, I'll go with P-4 for padding 4, and also a max width container of max width 5XL. And so we're going to go inside this grid and, like I mentioned, lay the elements in an order that would make sense. So I think it makes sense to start with the title here, which can be our H1. So I'll go H1, and the title here will say grid layout with Tailwind CSS. And let's add some quick style to this H1. So I'm going to go with text 4XL and font extra bold. I think it makes sense to next have this paragraph of text as our second element. So right there, I'll have a paragraph tag and paste some lorem ipsum. And then we're going to have our 8, I believe, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yep, image elements. So we're not going to use images. We're just going to use rectangles to illustrate the same layout. So let's come here and let's give them a height so we can see them, and a background of BG blue 500. So that's the first one, and we're going to go 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So you can see this nice spacing, and this is due to the fact we're already using a grid and we have this gap property. And we've got one more element, which is this bit of text here. So we're going to have one more paragraph of text with a bit of lorem ipsum as well. And as you can see for now, it doesn't look great, and also it's top and left aligned. So one thing we can do quickly is on the body tag here, add some classes, and we're going to perfectly center our grid in the middle of the page. So a grid, and here we're going to go with place, items, center, and we also need to apply a min height of screen. And there you go, you can see the vertical centering. And now we can start implementing the first of the two layouts, which is a 2-column grid. We're going to target the very first breakpoint, and remember I've created this extra small breakpoint, so we're going to go XS. And here we're going to define 2 columns with grid calls 2. And as soon as we hit the 540, I believe, breakpoint, we switch to 2 columns. Nice. All right, so let's zoom in a little bit in this section. So we want to have the title to occupy the 2 columns of the first row. So that's fairly easy to do. In my H1, I can once again target the extra small breakpoint. We want to span across 2 columns, so col span 2. The title takes the 2 columns, but we kind of want the heading to only span across half of it, across 1. So one thing we could do is tell the H1 tag to be 50% width. So XS and then width 1.5. And yeah, that works, and that's probably fine. But another thing you can do is define a grid within a grid. So we could say these two columns here occupied by the h1 tag should be a grid as well. And then inside the grid, there's two columns. So let me show you that quickly. Display grid to define a grid. And this grid would have grid calls two columns. We could wrap our heading tag in a span like so. And now if I take the background color here on the parent and I put it on the span instead, so you can see its actual width, you can see that the span is occupying one of the two cells. Now, if you pay close attention, you can see that the alignment is not perfect. The yellow clearly bleeds into the gap of the parent grid. Oops. On our grid here, also set a gap of 4, which matches the parent grid. And now we're going to occupy the exact correct amount of space.
Good job.
As soon as we jumped into a 2-column grid, we kind of want to have more squarish looking elements, so we're closer to something like this. So we could come here and select all our H16s, and on the extra small breakpoint, change that to H32. But we're going to have to keep doing this at different breakpoints, and we kind of want some square looking shapes, and we're going to use aspect ratio for that. So Tailwind CSS comes with an official aspect ratio plugin, but here I'm going to use a new CSS property, aspect ratio, to keep things simple and show you how it works. So let's jump in our CSS file. I'm going to open an @layer utilities block, and here I'll create a class called square, and it's going to set the aspect ratio property to a ratio of 1:1. We want to keep the height of 16 here. And then as soon as we reach the extra small breakpoint, we want to make these shapes become square. On extra small breakpoint, before we make it square, we're going to reset the height to auto, so it can be whatever it needs to be. And then on extra small breakpoint as well, we're going to use our square. And boom, look at this. Now elements are perfectly square. And as the size changes, they keep their proportion all the time, which is really nice. While we develop this section, let's go with 2:1, so it's a little bit more easy to see everything in one go, and we'll come and fix it later to be a square. Okay, so here's now when things become interesting. We want to take this paragraph here, and if we look at our design, you can see that it's not on the left, it's on the right after the image. So if you want this paragraph to be positioned here, we can tell it to start at the row line 2 and start at the column line 2. So let's come in our paragraph element, add a class. And so for the extra small breakpoint, row start, and we're going to start with 2. And we also want it to start at the col start 2. You can see the text is also vertically centered here. In this case, we're going to go with XS self center, which is align self center. And while we write it, let's do the same for the bottom text. And this bottom text is very selfish and very self-centered.
Oh, brother.
All right, so let's go and make our squares square with ratio 1:1. And what we're going to do now is handle the bigger grid when it jumps into 4 columns. So we're going to now focus on this one. And again, we're going to start at the top and try implement this. And I think at the medium breakpoint, we can go with grid calls 4. So now when we pass this medium breakpoint, our grid is going to jump into 4 columns. All right, so let's start with our heading, and we want now this heading to occupy 3 columns. So in our H1, at the medium breakpoint, we're going to have col span 3. Let's also increase the font size. So MD text, let's go with 5XL here. And remember, our text here is in the nested grid inside the main grid. So we're actually using 1.5 column. So we want to update our nested grid. The nested grid has 2 columns on the extra small breakpoint. And on the medium, it's going to have grid calls 3. But now this span is only using 1 column by default. So we need to make it occupy 2 out of the 3 columns. So MD col span 2. So now it's going to use 2 of the 3 columns of this little internal grid within the grid. All right, so on the second row, we want our paragraph text on the first two columns. And you can see that right now, the paragraph is still being told to start at the second row line and the second column line. We want to start at the first column line here. So let's find this paragraph. And on the medium breakpoint, we want to change this to call start 1. So call start 1. And now we want it to span across 2 rows. And you can probably guess the utility to use here. Call span 2. And just to show you, if I change the call start back to 2, it'll start at the second column, 3 will start at the third, etc. So it's really flexible where you position your elements within the grid. I think depending on the width of the column, the text gets way too close here. I can also, at the medium breakpoint, add a padding right. So I'm going to go with PR. Let's go with 12. And yeah, that looks nice. I'll be back.
A few moments later.
All right, we're back. So I think we can also boost the font size a little bit. So MD once again and text. Let's go with text LG. And let's do the same treatment for the bottom one. MD, text, LG. And while we are at this bottom one, especially now that we made it bigger, on the medium breakpoint, we want this paragraph to span on 2 columns with call span 2. All right, so this is looking pretty nice. This is getting fairly close to what we want to achieve. There's one subtle difference, or not so subtle. There is a gap here, an empty grid cell. So that's the element I'm talking about. So here on the medium breakpoint, I'm going to say call start 2. Look at that. It will push everything along. Little detail here, this element is actually center aligned. So here let's go with MD text center, and we'll also add some horizontal padding with PX4. And let's take a look at the design, starting with 2 columns here and then moving into 4 columns. And let's look at how we build this with CSS grid. So we start with a single column stacked all together, and we decide to use the order that makes the most sense for the content. So the heading, paragraph, images, and some text at the bottom. And once we pass our initial extra small breakpoint, the layout switches to 2 columns. Our paragraph is manually placed on the second row and second column lines, and the rest of it flows naturally. And when we reach the medium breakpoint, the grid jumps into 4 columns. This time the heading has 3 columns used, and then within it, 2 columns used for the text with one that stays blank. And we have positioned our element to span across 2 columns here, and then placing this blue rectangle here on the second column start, which allows us to push everything nicely. All right, that about wraps it up for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, I will see you in the next one. Bye for now. We did it. We recorded this video. I'm back.